Welcome to Badaboom. I'm Chris. On this episode of the podcast, we have on writer of Dynamite Space Ghost, David Pepose. Pepose, who recently came off introducing a new Punisher at Marvel, talks about the excitement and responsibility of carrying on Space Ghost's legacy. We also discuss different iterations of Space Ghost, including the popular Space Ghost Coast to Coast and how Pepose Runs seeks to differentiate itself from previous takes while preserving what makes Space Ghost Space Ghost. Listen in and bada boom. Hey David, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, excited to talk all things Space Ghost with you.
Yeah, I'm excited. So, Space Ghost coming out from Dynamite. Tell me a little bit how you got involved with the project.
Yeah. So I've been on Dynamite's radar for a while. I've known the publisher, Nick Barucci,
Mm,
for about 15 years now, dating back to my comics journalism days.
mm,
And so when I eventually made the leap into writing comics on my own, every time that I'd do a book, I would make sure that I'd send a copy to Dynamite. And
mm,
so I'd email Nick and I'd email editor Nate Cosby over there. And I had just worked on Moon Knight, City of the Dead, and the new Punisher miniseries over at Marvel back to back. And that sort of got me at a bit of a critical mass with Nate, who passed my work to Joe Ryban, our editor on the book, and said, I think David would be ready for prime time on this.
mm,
And Joe was kind enough to agree with him. And so Joe approached me at New York Comic Con last year. They had Dynamite had just announced their new licensing agreement with Warner Brothers Discovery and their new line of comics, starting with Thundercats. And Joe approached me at the show and said, "Hey, we've got a new we're doing Space Ghost, and you would be at the top of our list. Would you be interested? Would you have a take on this?" And yeah, it was one of those things. I even just from the jump, I was like, oh, I think there's something that could be really cool here. And then as I rewatched all the old episodes, I realized, oh, this is like a whole universe of just like top tier concepts that
mm.
have never really been explored in the comics industry. And so being able to take all these just amazing ingredients that Alex Toth had created and to use the longer runway of comics to really dig deep into it. That felt just like an irresistible opportunity, and it's made this series one of the most fun experiences of my career.
That's really awesome. And, I always felt that way about Space Ghost too. Like when I was a kid, and I'm sure sort of most people of this generation know Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And I would sort of like when I would watch that show and sort of like go into the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, I'd be like, oh, like, wow, this is like a really cool design. I wish they
Yeah,
really built it out. I wish there were like longer episodes and stuff like that. So there is a lot of space for that. Which is interesting because I think there's this balance where like, hey, like everyone kind of this generation knows them for Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which is,
right.
obviously a satire. But there is the other side of that where it's like, hey, like there's also a lot of room for reinvention and sort of like
Yeah.
introducing sort of new ideas. And what was that like as a writer to kind of like, sort of go between those things? Because I'm sure there's a
Sure.
lot of people that are going to show up to you at Comic-Con and being like, hey, like,
Watch
where's the
this coast to
humor?
coast. Well,
Yeah.
the thing for me is that I see Coast to Coast as it kind of preserved those original bones
Yeah.
of Space Ghost. It kept Space Ghost's name alive. It kept the awareness there. But yeah, it's one of those things. I think Space Ghost, every time that Space Ghost has reappeared, he's been a product of his time. The original Hanna-Barbera cartoons came out right on the heels of Adam West's Batman, and you see the shared DNA with that. And then the 81 Space Stars revival, that's coming out on the heels of Super Friends. It's coming out as sort of a contemporary to Spider-Man and his amazing friends. And then you have Coast to Coast, which I think really distills the irony of the MTV generation.
Yeah.
And so I think, and even, like Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti, who sort of brought Space Ghost back into comics in their 2005 miniseries, that came out just before Batman Begins. And you can
Yeah.
kind of see that as the zeitgeist, as that was like the gritty reboot. And so for us, the challenge that I understood the book to be was uh, how do you make Space Ghost a product of 2024? How do you kind of reintroduce that character and his world and his supporting cast and his villains using the storytelling techniques of 2024? And so that was something that I had a lot of fun with because as I rewatched all the original episodes,
Mm,
and you touched on this briefly,
mm,
they're only about 5 minutes a pop. There's
yeah.
no backstory, there's no continuity, there's very little in the room for room and character development. It's really surviving a lot on energy and vibes. And
Yeah.
Max's designs are
Yeah.
just so iconic that your brain kind of fills in some of the blanks. You see Zorak and you see that he's like a praying mantis, like an evil praying mantis, and you get a sense of who that guy might be just based
Yeah.
on the design. And same thing with Brack and Metalis and the rest of the Council of Doom. And so for me, it was really freeing. Those characters are so iconic and timeless that you can really kind of, as I rewatch them, you can zero in on certain qualities that stand out to you.
Yeah.
Brack, for example, being kind of, he's a blue collar mercenary. He's a
Mm.
pirate. There's something, he's not a world conqueror. There's something very down to earth about his aspirations. That he's just trying to steal like a gold freighter. Whereas like Zorak is a guy who like you see like the malevolence and you see like the spite. And that is a guy who like hates Space Ghost, has like real strong feelings towards him. And so you can kind of differentiate these characters and then figure out, okay, how do I add little wrinkles to each of them that speaks to these qualities that really stand out to me? How do I play up Brack as an opportunist? How do I play up Zorak as sort of this kind of frightening figure with his own kind of alien personality, his own alien way of looking at things? Metalis, he's a general. He's the guy who has his own army of robots and all these mechanical missiles. And so how do you kind of play all these things up? The Widow, she's not exactly a brawler. So how do you kind of play her up as more of a manipulator, as more of a thinker, and still make her like formidable as a villain? So I did that for every single villain that we're doing in this book. But I think ultimately the thing that really spoke to me is that Space Ghost, Jan, and Jace and Blip are kind of unexplored territory as characters. And that's something we're really digging into. I consider this book to be a coming of age story. This is very much, it's not Space Ghost year one, but it is maybe Jan and Jace year one.
Mm.
And this is sort of how they go from being these orphaned rescues to becoming Space Ghost trusted sidekicks and then eventually a found family in their own right. And it's sort of also Space Ghost having to adjust and accommodate for that. And this guy who sort of comes from tragedy and has pushed his humanity way, way down. How is he forced to reclaim that? How is he forced to face that? And how do these sidekicks wind up kind of bringing him back from the edge and making him a better person and a better hero? And so there's a lot of emotional grist for the mill, in addition to all the like high-flying sci-fi adventure. So it really is kind of like the perfect book, in a lot of ways, or the perfect character, because I'm able to explore all the stuff that I love most about the superhero genre and the sci-fi genre. And yeah, for an audience who many of them don't know who Space Ghost is. And all I say is this is the perfect jumping on point. You don't have to do any homework. We've already done it for you.
That's awesome. And for me, like sort of hearing you talk about it, what I've really liked is sort of the focus on the supporting cast. Cause I think
Yeah,
what sort of like what I loved about, Space Ghost Coast to Coast was just all the supporting characters and sort of the world of Space Ghost. And I think that Joe Kelly run did a really good job of focusing on Space Ghost. It's a very like
right.
personal, sort of almost like revenge story. Like you said, like
Yeah.
Batman Begins, him sort of almost half this like 12 issues, it's him sort of like building himself back up from sort of like, this high rank. So it's cool to kind of hear that you're sort of working on those side characters because I
Yeah.
think that's really important to sort of build the world of Space Ghost.
Yeah, well, my thinking was, of course, I read Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's run, and I read what Jeff Parker did on Future Quest and Future Quest Present. And my thinking was the standalone superhero origin had already been done, and it had already been done almost 20 years ago. And so my first thought was, how do I differentiate? And having this really be a true ensemble book that Jan and Jace are the POV characters in the same way that Kitty Pryde was for the X-Men
Yeah.
when she debuted. That felt like an interesting angle that hadn't been explored before. Because in 1966, Space Ghost shows up fully formed, and he's got Jan and Jason Blip, and there's really no explanation of how these characters cross paths. It was at the time the style of the time, and so nobody asked questions about
You
that.
just got
But
it. Hey, superheroes have
yeah,
sidekicks.
exactly. The year 2024, though, you have to think like, well, okay, why would this guy bring these, take in these
That's
two teams?
weird. Why is this
That's
adult
weird.
wicked?
Yeah, why like
Yeah.
why would he take these kids in? Why would he allow them onto the field to,
Mhm.
be his sidekicks? And these are all things that we get into in our series.
Yeah.
And so you'll know by the end of the first issue why Jan and Jace wind up in Space Ghost care. And yeah, I think in a lot of ways I wrote them as Dick Grayson and Babs Gordon meets Tim and Lex from Jurassic Park. And just kind of these fun characters who, like, the thing they say about kids is it's your heart running around on the outside.
Yeah.
And they you try controlling a young teenager and see how well that goes for you.
I
Space
have a
Ghost,
5-year-old. I can't control him. So
yeah,
just
Space Ghost is very good at fighting pirates, and he's good at fighting supervillains, but like dealing with kids, he's been way over his head. I've written him as I see him as the ultimate single dad.
yeah.
um, and sort of there's a little bit of friction there. He's built his life in a certain way. And of course, you throw kids into the mix, and it all your plans get blown up.
Yeah.
And so for him, it's for all of them, it's a push and pull of these kids and Space Ghost. Sometimes they learn from one another, sometimes they have setbacks, sometimes they have to lean on each other to kind of get back on their feet. But it is really kind of like a fun family drama in a lot of ways. And seeing the personality that these kids bring to the mix. Jan being kind of the feisty one. She's the one who has to be thoughtful and that think about things and be responsible because her dumb brother won't, and Space Ghost won't think about it. But also, like, that means that she'll tell Space Ghost off to his face.
Mhm.
And he'll race off to fight an asteroid field rather than deal with the wrath of a 13-year-old girl. Whereas Jace is like, he's the impulsive one. He leaps before he looks. He's a natural mechanic and a pilot. But he's also the comic relief. He's the one who's constantly throwing out one-liners, he's constantly throwing out jokes because he feels like, as long if I can keep people laughing, then like my surrogate family unit will
Mhm.
stay together. And sort of seeing them play off of each other as a yin and yang, and then them playing off of Space Ghost, who, he's the straight man in all of this, but every so often he gets like a real, like a zinger in there, usually at the kid's expense. But that's, I think, really a fun dynamic. That, like, it makes Space Ghost a very complex character, and that I think there's an inherent core of nobility to him. Why else would he take these kids in when they have nowhere else to go? On the other hand, it's easier said than done, and sometimes his irritation will show. But at the end of the day, when the chips are down, Space Ghost steps up, and I think that makes him such a unique character. Different than even Batman, where his sidekicks kind of rotate in and out, and at the same time, like, you can tell a Batman story where it's just Batman. I don't think you can tell a Space Ghost story with just Space Ghost. I think those three sidekicks are make him who he is and really set him apart from any other hero in the mainstream.
Yeah, and sort of kind of like how is it sort of designed right now? Because
Yeah.
is it planned to be an ongoing? Is it like a
Yeah.
mini series right now?
No, so we right now, when Dynamite approached me, and this was the thing that also made the series so attractive to me,
Yeah.
is they said, what do you think for a year to start? So this is about as ongoing as one gets
Yeah.
in the current market. And so I've got 12 issues in an annual already planned, with room to slot in more stories if the demand is
Mhm.
there. But yeah, the way that I am approaching the series is similar to books like Ryan North on Fantastic Four,
Mhm.
and Steve Orlando and Scarlet Witch, and Jed MacKay on Moon Knight, where those books all have a lot of self-contained done in one stories. And I thought that was kind of the way to make our runway feel extra long. In that, like, we're doing the Space Coast World Tour of villains in a lot of ways, similar to Batman: The Long Halloween, where that was I believe, a 13-part story where every issue, it would be Batman fighting the Joker, or
Mhm.
the Scarecrow and Mad Hatter, or Poison Ivy, or any number, or the Riddler, or any number of villains.
Mhm.
And that's the approach we're taking, is that we're going to rack up adventure after adventure after adventure, so fans get to know who Space Coast is. And that way, it also reclaims the power of a cliffhanger in the event that we have a couple of two-parters and maybe even a
Yeah.
three-parter planned. But that way, if you see to be continued, you know Space Ghost is in the thick of it. He's against his most dangerous enemies. He's gonna have to really fight extra hard to get his fight his way out. But my goal for this series was for readers month in and month out, they know they're gonna get a cool self-contained story. That still they all build on one another. But if you've missed an issue, you can jump on in. We're really trying to make this book as accessible as humanly possible.
That's awesome. I think, like I said, sort of the things you're talking about, I think that's kind of like what fans really want, something they can
Yeah.
really invest in, whether it's, something like Space Ghost or something at the big two. I think a lot of times people hold off on things because they're like, well, I'll trade weight it. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, because it's going to read better in that. And I think sort of like the series you mentioned are all great to pick up on a month to month basis because you're able to be like, hey, for 4.99, 3.99, I'm able to get this adventure. I'm able to close it, and
Yep.
then I'm excited for the next issue. And it also
Exactly.
gives you room, like having that that year commitment to create
Yeah.
those type of stories, and then also sort of weave in those B, C, D stories that could pay off
Yeah.
hopefully later on if you do get the
Yes.
opportunity to continue.
Exactly. I mean, I've already planned the whole thing out.
Mm,
I wanted to make sure that we had a very distinct beginning, middle, and end, because I think that's something else that's interesting to me about Space Ghost is I don't think he's a character that is built to have 60 years of continuing monthly stories like a Batman or a
right.
Superman. But I think, when you have characters like that, it is built on something that, a lot of people describe as the illusion of change.
Yeah.
Something changes, but inertia kicks in and they will eventually go back to status quo or something close to
Right.
it. And I think the cool thing about Space Ghost is, if Jan and Jace graduate, there's not another Jan and Jace waiting in the wings. And I
Yeah.
think that really speaks to this is a character that is designed to grow. This is a character that is designed to have setbacks and sort of rise up from them and change from them and sort of, have a distinct character arc. And so that was something that was really appealing to me is that I feel like this book has all the fun of the superhero genre, but none of some of the structural obstacles that can sometimes come with a long running series. We're really able to kind of just like swing for the fences on every single issue. We don't have to share our toys, and also we can just have the characters just grow, and I think that's like a really cool thing to be able to do with this series. And it's a very unique opportunity, but it's one that I feel extraordinarily grateful to be able to pursue.
Yeah, I love sort of when these older properties that maybe sort of have that opportunity or have had that law to sort of be reinvented. Like recently, I read Mark Russell and Steve Pugh's Flintstones,
Yeah.
and I just love the way that sort of took the Flintstones and was able to sort of add like this fuel of like social and political commentary, but also still have the things you love about the Flintstones, all the sort of things that like, hey, like they drive cars that are on rocks and stuff like that. And I think sort of Dynamite's done a really good job between this, Thundercats, of giving people sort of like, hey, this has not been around for a while, but it's clear people want this. Let's give it to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. The thing that really I think has surprised me the most about
Mm.
this book is just seeing the amazing groundswell support that we've gotten since we announced. I mean, I've written, I've written a lot of iconic characters. I've written Spider-Man, I've written Punisher, I've written Moon Knight, I've written two different teams of Avengers. I've written the Guardians, I've written the Fantastic Four, and I can tell you that seeing the just downright crazy amount of sheer positivity from showing one cover of Space Ghost blows everything I've done out of the water. And I think that's the thing that's really surprised me the most is that you think of Space Ghost as this like cult classic character, and
Yeah.
he is. But I think there's a deeper cultural relevance to him. This is a character that I think, his time in the spotlight has been like long overdue. And I owe not only the original Hanna-Barbera cartoon, but I also owe Coast to Coast for sort of priming everybody for this, where they're like, oh yeah, like this is a cool character, and it would be great to see like a traditional superhero take with him, and we're able to deliver that, and with this run that there's no shortage of love of the characters, and there's no shortage of love for the universe. If anything, it's been such a treat to be able to explore and develop that further while knowing that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And so, yeah, seeing how excited people are about this book, I don't necessarily feel pressure because I feel really strongly about
Mhm.
the angle that we're taking for this book, but it makes me feel it's very heartening to
Yeah.
see that. And I think when people read it and see how much we love these characters and how we're going to make you fall in love with these characters, I feel really good about this book, and I can't wait for people to really dive in and hopefully follow us for the long run.
Yeah, and what's really cool is, earlier you sort of mentioned your journey from like comics journalism to here. What's it been like sort of to be in that position now where you're launching this big series with Dynamite? You just came off introducing a new Punisher and you've written Avengers teams. Does it ever feel real sometimes where you're just like, oh wow, like
No,
I'm here?
no, not at all. No, I think I'm still kind of constantly catching myself of
Yeah.
just like, oh no, this is the job. And I always want to make sure I'm worthy of it. I want to
Yeah.
make sure that I'm not only putting out the best work that I possibly can, but also just kind of being the best citizen I can be in the industry. And yeah, I feel like this is always like an ongoing process. I feel like I'm constantly kind of refining things. Sometimes it feels like I'm reinventing the wheel. But I'm always trying to figure out like, okay, how do I improve my work? How do I increase the speed? How do I
Yeah.
make things more sustainable? Is there a way to work smarter as well as harder?
Mhm.
And it is constant. No one's more surprised than me to see to see that I've lasted as long as I've lasted. I think I just marked my 7th year since my first book hit the direct market, and that's wild to me.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of ways, I still feel like I just got here.
Mhm.
But yeah, at the same time, I do look at certain books like I don't think I would have been able to write Space Ghost in the way that I've written it without the reps that I've put in with other books, books like Punisher and books like Savage Avengers and even my creator own work,
Yeah.
stuff like Scout's Honor or going to the chapel, all that kind of came into Space Ghost. So when I look at that, I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
okay, like I guess that worked out okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I write everything like it's going to be the last thing I'm going to write because one day it will be.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'd like to stay at this business for a long time. I always say I want to be a 30-year man. I guess I'm about a quarter of the way there, a little shy of that now. So yeah, I've still got a way to go. And yeah, but getting opportunities like Space Ghost, it really is it reminds me why I love this business so much, and seeing how enthusiastic everyone has been about the book. Um, yeah, it means a lot to me, and that I'm going to be sort of holding on to that as I keep working on the series.
Yeah, well, congratulations. Again, it's really great to see that. And time flies. As a parent, I could tell you, I blink and I'm like, wait, but this guy's a man. He needs to start paying rent already. So I'm sure you're gonna hit that 30-year mark pretty soon. But what can fans expect? Outside of Space Ghost, is there any projects you're working on that you could talk about that fans could be on the lookout
Yeah.
for?
Well, so the final issue of my horror series, The Devil That Wears My Face, comes out May 8th. So that'll be the Wednesday after Space Ghost #1 drops. So issue 6 of that is really fun. Our series is Face Off Meets The Exorcist, about a Vatican priest who performs an exorcism and it backfires. So he's stuck in a stranger's body while a demon has hijacked his body and runs back to the Vatican to wreak havoc. So yeah, things are bad in Rome right now.
No.
In our book, the demon legion has ascended to, I think, an even higher status than he thought possible. So Father Vieri is going to have to kind of come back for one final showdown, and we've got a really fun twist in that book that nobody's picked up on yet. But I think it turns the whole series on its ear a little bit, and it's something very personal to me. So I can't wait for people to read that. Alex Cormack has drawn the work of his career
Mm.
in that book. So pick up issue 6. Tell your local comic shop if you don't have the other 5 issues, order it through them, or you can order it through Mad Cave Studios. Yeah, what else? Let's see. I'm working on another big two project right now. It'll be a little while before we can announce it. I'm literally
Mm.
working on the first script right now.
Mm.
Working on more Space Ghost.
Mm.
I'm in the middle of issue 5 on that right now. That's the back half of our first two-parter. So keep your eyes peeled on that. And yeah, I have another creator-owned thing that hopefully I'll be able to talk about later this year. That is mostly finished in production already. It's a very different genre than I've worked in before, but one that is near and dear to my heart. And Yeah. Oh, and then my Kickstarter, the OZ, our Ringo Award winning Mad Max meets the Wizard of Oz series, that'll be returning to Kickstarter later in the summer. It's already fully written. The art is mostly completed. Ruben Rojas is doing amazing work on it. So yes, once Space Ghost kind of finds its feet, that Kickstarter will be the next big thing that I'll be pushing. So keep your eyes peeled because I will be talking about that nonstop once we launch.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I'm sure you're gonna have a lot more fans after this Space Ghost run, where
Hey, from
people
your
are
lips to the
tuning
comic pad's ears.
in. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm excited to read Space Ghost next week, and jump into the comic shop and see all those wonderful covers actually physically in my hands, especially
Thank you.
that Cho cover. But
Yeah,
that's
Michael
a
Cho's doing fantastic work on this. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time.
no, and thank you. And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom!
Thank you for listening to the Badaboom podcast. Keep the conversation going on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Get in the comments on our YouTube channel and let us know what you'd like to hear next. And please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen.